It's my pleasure to introduce to you Ambassador Dennis Ross, who is the counselor and Davidson Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy and a distinguished professor in the practice of diplomacy at Georgetown. He was the director of policy planning in the State Department for George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton's Middle East peace envoy, and the special assistant to the president under Barack Obama. For almost 3 decades, Ambassador Ross has been a leading figure in the diplomatic world of Soviet and Middle East policy. During the Reagan administration, he served as Director of Near East and South Asian Affairs on the National Security Council staff, and as Deputy Director of the Pentagon's Office of Net Assessment. In the first Bush administration, he served as Director of the State Department's Policy Planning Office, where he played a prominent role in developing U.S. policy toward the former Soviet Union, the unification of Germany and its integration into NATO, arms control negotiations, and the development of the 1991 Gulf War coalition. Under President Clinton, Ambassador Ross was the special Middle East coordinator as a point person in America's ongoing role in the Middle East peace process. He was instrumental in assisting Israelis and Palestinians in reaching the 1995 interim agreement. He successfully brokered the Hebron Accord in 1997, facilitated the 1994 Israel-Jordan peace treaty, and worked to bring Israel and Syria closer together. Please join now in welcoming Ambassador Dennis Ross.
Thank you. Well, obviously there's nothing for me to talk about because what's going on, right? So I prefer to address what was really important that was concluded today, which was a 6-year agreement with Brandon Crawford to ensure that he will remain. You know, I grew up in Marin County, so I grew up as a Giants fan. And so I felt like I need to start off with something that's positive, right? In my own shul, every Saturday morning, people come up to me and they say, "Can you tell us something positive? You know, can you tell us something good about the Middle East?" I said, "What do you think I am? A miracle worker?" But the title of the book is called Doomed to Succeed. So actually, when you leave tonight, aside from getting the book, when you leave tonight, you'll actually feel, all right, there's at least one thing that is potentially a factor for you to be optimistic about. So let me start off with what are not factors for you to be optimistic about. I'm going to talk about the book, but I'm going to start by talking about Paris, because it would be a little strange for me to be here and not address that at all. And I'll actually use it to link it back to the book. We should all be concerned, not just because of what happened, but in a sense, how it happened. I mean, here was a terrorist operation that was extremely well coordinated, 6 separate targets, 3 operational cells, no shortage of weapons, so an easy access to weapons, meaning automatic weaponry, hand grenades, suicide vests, meaning explosives were available. And this came as a complete surprise in a place like France, and Paris in particular, where the French are known to have a very serious intelligence organization. And after Charlie Hebdo in January, they have been on a higher alert. And yet, this came off as something that was a complete surprise. What we know now is that at least the mastermind probably came out of Syria. They lived in, 3 of the 3 brothers lived in Brussels, in one particular neighborhood of Brussels. And we also know now that there are 2 people, 2 fugitives, who didn't die in the operation, that the French are trying to find, actually the Belgians as well. I mean, until today we thought there was only 1. Now it turns out there's 2. My guess is we're going to find out that there were others who were in fact contributors to this, and that the numbers involved were probably 2 or 3 times as large as those who we are aware of today. Now here again it means they were able to communicate with nobody knowing. They were able to plan this operation with nobody knowing. And the fact that you're talking about an operation in a place where, in fact, security and intelligence are taken seriously tells you that there are real gaps in the intelligence that the French had. The fact that today there was an operation that was preempted in Germany tells you that probably what has gone on is that in the, quote, Islamic State, in Raqqa, which is the capital of that state, at least as they define it, in Syria, they have probably been engaging in plans to do this sort of thing for some time. My guess is that they've been planning for some time because they anticipated they were going to be suffering some setbacks on the ground in Syria and Iraq. And what they want to do is to divert attention away from their failings, capture the imagination or the attention of those who they think can still be recruited to their purpose. I mean, this is an apocalyptic group. It is a kind of ended days group. They believe they have to create a kind of polarization. They themselves talk about what they call the gray zone, meaning there are Muslims who live in Europe who they don't see as being sufficiently devout, but they can bring back into the fold by creating this sense of polarization. So we are looking at something that is going to be, I think, problematic for some time to come. We've gotten a reminder that whatever successes we've had against ISIS on the ground in Syria and Iraq, those successes are still pretty limited, and they're not nearly enough to be able to preempt them from doing these kinds of things. And so much so that, think about it, small numbers of people can bring large cities to a standstill. And I'm afraid we're going to be facing this for some time to come. Now, in an interesting way, the reality of what we're seeing also contributes to what we've seen in terms of the last 2 months with regard to Palestinian acts of terror. These are very intimate forms of terror, stabbings. Why do I say there's a connection between the two? There isn't a connection in any literal sense, but there's a connection from the following standpoint. You're looking at who's been carrying out these acts of terror in Israel, and for the most part, they are carried out by kids. And we're talking about people between the ages of 15 and 25, mostly motivated by social media, largely incited by what was a false narrative that Israel was in fact preparing to do to what they call the Haram al-Sharif, the noble sanctuary. This is what we Jews call the Temple Mount. They were saying that the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is on the platform, that the Israelis were going to do to that what they do in Hebron. In Hebron, you have the Tomb of the Patriarchs. This is where Abraham is buried. On one side, you have the Tomb of the Patriarchs, meaning where Abraham is buried, and on the other side, you have the Ibrahimi Mosque. Abraham was a father to Jews and Muslims alike. And this false narrative was that Israel was planning to create on the Haram, on the Temple Mount, what was a shared facility just like you have in Hebron. And many of those carrying out the attacks were saying they were doing it for Al-Aqsa. So this was, in a sense, as I said, a false narrative in which you saw social media used to pervade this false narrative and to, in a sense, incite people to violence. But these 15 to 25-year-olds who were acting, they were also acting in a context. And the context was that no one was paying attention to them. When it comes to their own leadership, they look at them and basically see them as being irrelevant. There's a recent Palestinian poll which shows that 80% of the Palestinians view the Palestinian Authority as corrupt. 66% believe that Abu Mazen should resign. And for these 15 to 25-year-olds, their leadership seems completely out of touch, completely irrelevant to them. But also the Arabs are paying no attention to them. The international community is paying no attention to them. And what you've just seen is a stark reminder for them. No one is paying attention to them. The Arabs are consumed. The Gulf states are consumed with Iran. Egypt is consumed with the radical Islamists. Jordan is consumed with having to deal with ISIS. And the rest of the world now is consumed with dealing with ISIS. And where do the Palestinians fit in? They don't fit in. So they're angry at their own leadership. They're angry at the Arabs. They're angry at us because we're not paying attention. And they're angry at the Israelis because they see no prospect of change. And then they get incited. It's a very combustible mix. I describe the terror that they've carried out as being an intimate form of terror. Stabbings. I mean, think about it. Nothing can be more intimate than stabbings as a form of terror. You see your victim. Literally, it's bloodletting. This isn't like what you just saw in Paris, where you take an automatic weapon and you just fire it into a crowd. This is a very intimate form of terror. What was the administration's response to it when it first began? Did the administration refer to it as terror? No. It talked about violence and the need to stop the violence, and it talked about a cycle of violence, as if what was going on was somehow connected to what the Israelis were doing. Settlements were even raised as somehow creating a justification, or if not a justification, a rationalization for what was going on. And yet, this was not done because of anything specific the Israelis were doing. This was an intimate form of terror. And there was a reluctance to describe it that way, at least for several days. In fact, even the term cycle of violence should have been completely irrelevant. The response should have been, these are acts of terror, the incitement that is provoking it needs to stop, and the terror needs to stop, and there's no justification. But that wasn't done. And what it reflected was a mindset that you shouldn't simply be critical only of the Palestinians. You shouldn't be, in a sense, focused only on the Palestinians to the exclusion of the Israelis because it might produce a backlash. Now that mindset, which was reflected by the administration's response to these acts of terror, is a mindset that has been in every administration from Truman to Obama. It is part of a constituency that has been a part of every administration from Truman's time until now. So now that I have your attention, I'm going to keep your attention because I want to pose a question to you. I just said every administration from Truman to Obama has had a constituency in the national security apparatus that sees Israel through a lens. To be more precise, they see Israel through a lens that Israel's a problem and not a partner. Okay? In every administration, the perception in a part of the national security establishment was that Israel was a problem and not a partner. ICC. See, I know people here, it turns out. Okay. You grow up in the area, you know people. All right. So every administration, from Truman to Obama, has a constituency in the national security establishment that sees Israel as a problem, not a partner. The impulse is not to collaborate with it, but to, in a sense, compete with it. There was only one administration, however, in which that constituency existed but had no influence. So which administration was it? Carter? Did you hear what I said? I said this is a constituency that viewed Israel as a problem, not a partner. In the Carter administration, there was only one constituency, and it saw Israel only as a problem, never as a partner. If you go through the Carter diaries, as I did to write the Carter chapter, I mean, you'll see when you read the Carter chapter, as you all will, you'll see that Carter, is at times, he singles out the Israelis in a way that nobody else does. At one point, he tells Moshe Dayan that Israel is the sole impediment to peace. You're worse than any of the Arabs. And Dayan says, we don't have one Arab state that is prepared to recognize us, And you're saying we're worse? We're the reasons there's no peace? In his diary after Camp David, when both Sadat and Begin are awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, in his diaries, Carter says, I'm quoting, he says, Sadat deserved it, Begin didn't. Okay, so Carter was not the administration in which the constituency that saw Israel as a problem had no influence. Okay, so the question is, so which administration, from Truman until today, which administration had that constituency, but that constituency had no influence? No, I think that Donald Trump sees everything as a problem. Now, if somebody said Bush 43, right? Bush 43 is a very good guess. It's wrong, but it's an extremely good guess. And I'll tell you why it's an extremely good guess. President Obama in July of 2009 met with a group of Jewish leaders. And one of them said to him, look, if you want Israel to be able to take moves towards peace, they need to know you're right next to them. They need to be reassured by knowing you're right next to them. And President Obama said to the person who raised this, and by the way, this is just after I had just gotten to the White House at that point. I wasn't in this meeting. I had just begun. I wasn't in this meeting, but so he says, look, in answer to the idea that we have to be right next to Israel, the president says, for 8 years, George W. Bush allowed there to be no daylight between the United States and Israel, and what did it get us? Israel stood and did nothing, and it alienated the Arabs. So if President Obama were sitting here and had not yet read the book, he would say the same thing George W. Bush. But first problem is that his history was not good, and I'll explain it. I mean, it is ironic that he would say, what did it get us? Well, what it got us was Ariel Sharon unilaterally withdrew from Gaza and forced settlements in the West Bank precisely because he felt that Bush was close to him and there was an exchange of letters and commitments. Ehud Olmert, in 2008, decided to break through everything and presented a set of proposals that went beyond the Clinton parameters to try to resolve the conflict, and he never drew a response from Abu Mazen. So the fact that there was a closeness actually did produce something from the Israelis. But the truth is that constituency did have an influence in Bush. The constituency I was talking about had an influence in Bush because after 9/11, in the first call to Ariel Sharon, after 9/11, President Bush, after he had declared a war on terror, is pressuring Sharon to have his foreign minister, then Shimon Peres, meet with Yasser Arafat. Now, at the time, there are bombs going off in Israel. The president has declared a war on terror. He wouldn't have dreamed of having us talk to those responsible for 9/11. But he is pressing Sharon to have Peres meet with Arafat. And the reason was that constituency I was talking about, they made the case that 9/11 was because of Israel. 9/11 was because we hadn't solved the Palestinian problem. And if we wanted to have partners to deal with the war on terror, we had to solve the Palestinian problem. That was the key issue. So this constituency that tended to view Israel as a problem, not a partner, they had sufficient weight that they were able to persuade the president after 9/11 to engage in that phone call. Now, it's true over time Bush changes. He comes to say, and he writes about this, by the way, in his memoirs, he sees that, look, if there's a war on terror for us, there can't be one set of rules for us and a different one for the Israelis. He even gives a speech in 2008 in Israel to the Knesset, in which he says, you may be 7 million, but you're really 307 million because you have us backing you. So the constituency was there, and Bush over time would temper it, but they never go away, and you'll see from time to time during the Bush administration that, in fact, they reemerge in terms of their influence. So Bush was a good guess, just wasn't the right guess. So you're probably wondering what the real answer is. How many people want to know the real answer? All right, it was Clinton. Now, it's true I was Clinton's negotiator. so that might have had something to do with it. But that's not the whole story. The real story is that Clinton believed that the United States was Israel's only friend. And as Israel's only friend, there was no problem with us having differences as long as we kept them private. He felt that if you created a wedge between the United States and Israel, that it would encourage Israel's enemies. It would weaken Israel's deterrent. And our job was to strengthen Israel's deterrent, not weaken it. Okay, so you like this format of I ask you questions? The good news is I know the answers to all my questions. All right, so how about another question? All right, good. See, I really piqued your interest. And see, you're up to Obama, so you should know the answers to some of these things. I may quiz those who've read it already. Okay, so which administration do you think was the hardest on Israel? The toughest on Israel? All right, Obama, one guess. Carter, another guess. Who said Eisenhower? Eisenhower. You've been listening to the book? Okay. All right, so yes, the answer is Eisenhower. And Eisenhower is the toughest. I'm going to describe, there's some other administrations that do some things that even Eisenhower didn't do, and I'll explain those in a second. But Eisenhower is the toughest because Eisenhower comes in, Eisenhower is convinced that Truman was shaped only, his policy towards the Middle East was entirely a function of politics and that the Jews had too much control on this. This is Eisenhower's view. And why does he feel this way? He feels this way because Truman has recognized Israel over the united opposition of all of his national security advisors. Every one of them is against recognition. And Truman recognizes anyway, the people, these advisors are known as, if you go back in time, you'll find there was a book called The Wise Men. And it's about all of those who helped shape the institutions of the Cold War, people like George C. Marshall, who's the Secretary of State, Forrestal, who's the Secretary of Defense, George Kennan, who's the author of Containment. All of them are against the recognition of the Jewish state. And Eisenhower feels the only reason that Truman would have done this over their opposition was it must have been politics. It must be because of the influence of the Jews. Literally. Now, what is ironic is, of course, that Truman does do recognition, but he imposes an arms embargo on Israel shortly after the partition plan is voted at the UN, and even after the 1948 war, after Israel is invaded by all of its neighbors, we maintain the arms embargo throughout the entire Truman administration. And yet, Eisenhower feels that he's totally, in a sense, shaped by political considerations and Jewish influence. I want to describe this in a little bit more detail to give you more of a context for understanding Eisenhower. Truman it takes courage for him to do what he does. On May 12th, 1948, he has a meeting in the Oval Office. He brings in Marshall, Robert Lovett, who's the Undersecretary of State, and Clark Clifford, who is his domestic political counselor. Now, Marshall walks in, and the meeting is called, by the way, because on midnight, 12:01, May 15th, the British will complete their withdrawal from Palestine. And we know at that point that David Ben-Gurion is likely to declare Israel as a state. And so this meeting is called to decide what should we do. Now, Marshall comes in and Marshall says, don't recognize, we should create trusteeship there. And Robert Lovett supports him. He's the Undersecretary of State. He says, this is going to be a Soviet outpost because you got a lot of communist agents who have gone, and they're part of this. They're part of what's there. And the president turns to Clark Clifford, who's the domestic political counselor. Before he can say anything, Marshall says, "Why is he here? This is a national security meeting, and he's the domestic political counselor." And Truman says, "Well, because I asked him." So he turns to Clifford, and Clifford had written 2 memos in March and then again in May, shortly before this meeting. In each of the memos, he argues only in national security terms, and he does it here again. He starts off by saying, look, notwithstanding what the experts in the intelligence community here have said, the Jews have proven to be quite viable. I mean, what he was referring to is the day before the partition vote in the UN, the CIA had come out with an intelligence finding. I'm sure it was just purely a coincidence that the day before the partition vote, they came out with an intelligence finding that said a Jewish state couldn't be viable, couldn't last 2 years. If it was going to be sustainable, you'd need to have hundreds of thousands of American forces there. Otherwise, no way it could survive. If you ever want to kill an idea, just simply say you need hundreds of thousands of American forces to be there. All right? So this comes out the day before the partition vote. In January of 1948, George Kennan, who I mentioned before, and Loy Henderson, for whom a large auditorium in the State Department is named, wrote a memo that basically said the same thing and argued for reversing partition and going with trusteeship because a Jewish state would be a disaster for us in the region. So Clifford argues and says, notwithstanding what all the experts said, it turns out they're quite viable. They've got no help from us because we had an arms embargo. And yet, they actually now control more territory than was originally the case in the partition plan because they've been attacked within Palestine. And they've proven to be far more capable as fighters than those who they're fighting. So for us not to recognize them, we will be penalizing the Jews. What would be the basis for us to penalize the Jews? That was his first argument. His second argument was, if we give in to threats from the Arabs over violence now, because the Arab states were threatening they were going to intervene, then it would be a case of appeasement. And that won't strengthen American credibility worldwide. Actually, it will weaken our credibility. And his third argument was, we're not going to lose Arab oil because they can't drink their oil. They have to sell their oil. Now, at this point, Marshall was really agitated, and he cuts him off. And he says, these are only political arguments. Have you heard a political argument there? It's a rhetorical question. He says, these are only political arguments. And Marshall says, and understand, Marshall was a lifelong soldier, right? I mean, 5-star general. He said, if I were to vote, because he had never voted. As a military man, he'd never voted. So he said, if you were to recognize, if you were to respond to these arguments, and if you were to go ahead and recognize, and if I were to vote, I would vote against you. The Secretary of State, saying this to the President, casts the pall on the meeting. The President says, well, General, I'm inclined to agree with you. And the meeting ends. Now, Lovett, who had been part of the meeting and obviously had reflected Marshall's views, leaves the meeting and is feeling, this is a terrible outcome. I mean, you can't have this kind of a split between the Secretary of State and the President. So that night he goes to see Clifford, and they work out an arrangement where the President will recognize after the declaration of statehood. And Marshall, when he's then asked by his staff, why did you go along with this? I mean, think about it. He's asked by his staff, why did you go along with this? And he says, well, he is the President of the United States. So Truman does something that takes courage, but as I said, he imposes an arms embargo for the life of his administration, even though arms are flowing to all of Israel's neighbors from the British. And he also doesn't provide any assistance, economic assistance to Israel, until after Israel's first vote. Israel's first vote for what is the parliament, the Knesset, is January 31, 1949. Declaration of Statehood is May 15, 1948. Between May 15, 1948 and the end of January, you end up having what is a war that ends up costing the Israelis 1% of their population. There's by January 31, 1949, the armistice agreements have been concluded, the war has ended. But Israel is also absorbing at this point the Jews of the Arab world who are forced to leave with no possessions. This is actually a fairly wealthy set of communities, right? They're forced to leave with nothing. And they come to Israel. Israel begins to absorb a population. Over the next couple of years, they absorb a population that is larger than the one that existed at the time of the war, the 48 war. At this period, Israel literally never has more than 1 week's supply of food on hand. It is a very poor place. And it takes 6 months before there's any assistance that's provided. And the assistance that's provided initially is mostly in the form of loans. There is some limited grant assistance, but it's mostly loans. And yet, this behavior by Truman is seen by Eisenhower as reflecting something fundamentally not in our interest and done only for political reasons. So when he comes in, he's going to correct what he sees as a pure imbalance. One of the first things he does, Israel actually decides to use Jordan River water for irrigation, and they're also thinking about using it for hydroelectric power. When they do it, Eisenhower suspends the loans that were still outstanding to the Israelis as a punishment to show, because the Arabs didn't like it, so this is how he responded. John Foster Dulles takes a trip to the region for 3 weeks in May of 1953, and he goes and he says in these meetings, we are correcting the imbalance. We are not beholden, the way the Democrats were, to domestic politics. We will do what's in our interest, and what's in our interest is to have relations with the Arabs. What I just said, he says very explicitly. He stops in Lebanon, his first stop, and he sees the president of Lebanon, and he says to him, not only is our policy going to be different, but he says, we will counter Israeli aggression. Now, in May of 1953, were there occupied territories? Were there? Israel is very small. In 1953, it's 9 miles wide at its narrowest point. And every single one of its neighbors rejects its existence. And every single one of its neighbors except Lebanon is allowing fedayeen, self-sacrificers, to carry out attacks into Israel. And he says, we will counter Israeli aggression. I mean, this is a very different approach. In the 1956 war, we, the United States, when Israel goes in, and the plan is something that's worked out with the British and the French, and the British and the French are pushing the Israelis to do this because they want to teach Nasser a lesson. The French because they think that he's responsible for the war in Algeria. The British because once he nationalizes the Suez Canal, they think this is as Anthony Eden says, this is a bone in our throat. We can't live with it. And what does the United States do? The United States, the Eisenhower administration, authors a Security Council resolution that calls on all nations, all countries, to cease their ties with Israel until Israel withdraws. It calls on all nations, any nation that's providing any assistance, to stop assistance to Israel. Now, this resolution is vetoed by the British and the French. It is, of course, the last time they will veto a resolution in the UN that would favor Israel, but they were part of the planning for this. Eisenhower threatens sanctions against Israel. He has his Undersecretary of State, Herbert Hoover Jr., call in the Israeli ambassador to the United States and threaten expulsion from the UN. This is pretty tough stuff, right? So this is really the toughest administration. By the way, Dulles, you'll see it when you read the Eisenhower chapter, as you all will. You'll see that at one point, Dulles, in a conversation with Charles Luce, is explaining to him that Marshall and Forrestal tried to have a policy not run by the Jews. They didn't succeed, but he was going to succeed. I'm quoting. All right, so this is a very tough administration when it comes to Israel. Now, it is true, it doesn't suspend arms shipments to Israel. Why? Because it provides no arms to Israel. When the Israelis make requests to the Eisenhower administration for arms at a time when the Soviets are providing very significant arms to Egypt and Syria and after 1958 to Iraq, when the Israelis make a request, they're told, you should rely upon the goodwill of your neighbors. Now, all of their neighbors reject their existence. So this is basically the approach of the Truman administration, of the Eisenhower administration. But as I said, they don't suspend arms shipments to the Israelis because, after all, there are no arms shipments to the Israelis. There is, however, one administration that suspends arms shipments to Israel as a punishment. Got a guess at which administration it is? Which one? Nixon, Obama? No, Obama's never suspended arms shipments. Who? No, not Bush 1. Not Carter. I'll give you a hint. It was we suspended F-16 deliveries to Israel. Not Johnson. Keep guessing. Reagan. Reagan suspends F-16 deliveries after the Israelis carry out the attack against the Iraqi nuclear reactor at Osirak. It is true later on, Reagan says, well, maybe that wasn't such a bad idea after all. But he suspends them again in December of 1981. They do that in May of 81. After he resumes the shipments, when Menachem Begin extends Israeli law and administration to the Golan Heights, he suspends the F-16s again. But this is not the low point of the relationship in the Reagan administration. The low point is during the summer of 1982 during the siege of Beirut. And at this point, on 5 occasions, Reagan actually threatens the future of the relationship because he feels that the Israelis are lying to him. Caspar Weinberger at this time actually presses for us to cut relations, to break relations with Israel, as if they're Cuba or North Korea. Reagan doesn't do that. And Reagan, in the end, changes. Reagan's administration, which I just described as being actually one of the lowest points in the relationship. I mean, he suspends F-16s as a punishment. Twice. He threatens the future of the relationship 5 times during the summer of 82 and into the fall of 82. But he also is the president who, starting in January of 1984, presides over a fundamental transformation of the relationship. And that transformation leads to Israel being treated as an asset, a strategic asset, and he creates an institutional architecture to deal with Israel as a strategic partner. So the structure of our relationship with Israel, militarily, in a security sense, in an intelligence sense, even economically, all flows from the Reagan administration and the creation of something that was called the Joint Political Military Group, which was established in January of 1984. And it emerges because, in a sense, the realities have changed. When Israel in the September of 82, I mean, the real low point is Sabra and Shatila, when you have 2 Palestinian refugee camps where the Phalange go in and basically kill everyone they see in the camps. And they do it because it's revenge for the killing of their leader, who's assassinated not by the Palestinians but probably by the Syrians in a big bombing. And it's the IDF that permits them to go in. And this is really the low point. Now, at this point, the Syrians are saying to the Saudis that they will get out of Lebanon if Israel gets out of Lebanon. This is a point after Israel has cut the Beirut-Damascus highway, forced the Syrian forces back, defeated the Syrian Air Force. What happens is that by May of 1983, George Shultz negotiates an agreement called the May 17th Accord, in which Israel agrees that they will get out of Lebanon if Syria will get out. Only at this point, Syria has been rebuilt. Its military has been rebuilt by the Soviets. The Soviets come in and man their air defense. They provide long-range surface-to-air defense missiles, SAM-5s. The Syrians are supporting now militias. Hezbollah emerges. They're created by the Revolutionary Guard of Iran. They're responsible for blowing up 241 Marines in the Marine barracks. After this takes place, Reagan reverts to his basic instincts. And I say his basic instincts for a reason. Reagan, during World War II, did training films. And because of that role, he was among the first to see the films of the liberations of the death camps. And he kept them. He tells George Shultz, when George Shultz was Secretary of State, he still has those films. Because he said they were so awful, he was convinced that people wouldn't believe him unless he could show it to them. From that, he develops a deep, abiding sense of moral obligation to Israel. Now, it doesn't prevent him in the first 2 years when he sees Israeli surprises, when there's a battle over AWACS. And by the way, because of the battle over AWACS, at one point, Reagan, October 1, 1981, he gives a press conference where he says, "It is not the business of any foreign country to make American foreign policy." It's a press conference in response to what's going on with Israel and Jewish groups fighting AWACS in the Congress. I mean, it's about as blunt a statement on dual loyalty as you could make. And yet, we don't remember Reagan that way because Reagan's the one who helps to transform the relationship. Fundamentally, he does. He goes back to his instincts. After the bombing of the Marine barracks, he goes back to his instincts. And he sees in Israel a partner. And he decides he will override the opposition of Caspar Weinberger. And he creates what I described was a structure of relations that every president since that time has built on, even if they didn't have an emotional attachment to Israel. And Reagan really did. And it comes back, it reemerges. Now, something else reemerges during the Reagan administration. It doesn't reemerge, it emerges. I've described this constituency that existed from Truman until today that sees Israel as a problem. And a different constituency, not of individuals, but of expertise, emerges in the Reagan administration, cultivated in no small part by George Shultz, that sees Israel as a partner, not a problem, believes that we do best not only with Israel, but in the region when we partner with Israel and we collaborate with Israel. And from the Reagan administration on, there have been these two constituencies. Each at different administrations, you'll see the balance between them shifts. I was saying during Clinton's time, the balance shifted entirely in the direction of those who saw Israel through the lens of being a partner with whom you collaborate with. Now, the constituency that has seen Israel as a problem has basically absorbed and believed in three assumptions. They're interrelated. One is that if you distance from Israel, you gain with the Arabs. The corollary is if you cooperate with Israel, you lose with the Arabs. And the third assumption is that if you want to transform the American position in the region, you have to solve the Palestinian problem. These three assumptions have been deeply embedded in the consciousness, and in a sense, when I say embedded in the consciousness, they're sort of there in every administration. And these three assumptions have been fundamentally wrong. So what I want to do, instead of going through every example that prove them wrong, I'm going to highlight a couple of examples that will crystallize this for you. One of the things I do in the book is I show in different chapters, when I go through different events and how we respond to them, I show how you'll see echoes that reverberate over time. And I'm going to do that now when I cite some of the examples for you. Right. The first assumption I said was if you distance from Israel, you gain with the Arabs. Now, President Obama embodied that at the beginning of the administration. That's why he says in that July meeting, for 8 years there was no daylight and we got nothing. The implication was he was going to create daylight, and he had, and he did. But it didn't produce anything. But his example is not the most egregious one. The most egregious one is Nixon. And it's in March of 1970. In March of 1970, Nixon suspends F-4 Phantoms to Israel not as a punishment. Reagan did it as a punishment. Nixon does it because he's trying to reach out to Nasser in Egypt. And he thinks by stopping or suspending arms to Israel that Nasser will respond to us. Now, what makes it egregious, I said it's the most egregious example, what makes it egregious is that at the moment he does this, this is the very moment where the Soviets, for the first time, decide to send their military personnel outside of the Soviet bloc to Egypt. And they take over Egyptian air defense. They send 10,000 Soviet forces to Egypt. They are doing this at the very time that Nixon decides that he's going to suspend arms shipments to the Israelis. I have felt that President Obama has been too passive in response to what Putin has been doing in Syria, but I have to say that the example of Nixon makes Obama look relatively okay. I mean, this is pretty extraordinary to suspend at the very moment that the Soviets are crossing a threshold, something they haven't done before. He sends his Undersecretary of State at that time, Joe Sisko, to see Nasser to make the case, look, we've suspended the Phantoms to Israel, so you should respond to us. And how do you think that Nasser responds? Does he do handstands? Does he sing Kumbaya? Does he say, oh, I've seen the light? No. He makes new demands. You didn't do enough. You need to do more. So the distancing never gets you anything. And I'm going to explain why after I cite one more example. So the second assumption is if you cooperate with Israel, you lose with the Arabs. All right, so the first administration to sell arms to Israel is John Kennedy. He provides the Hawk anti-aircraft missile, a purely defensive weapon system. Now, before he makes the decision, his readiness to consider it triggers a huge debate within the administration. And the Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, is dead set against it. He says it will set a terrible precedent and it will cause us grave damage with the Arabs. Now, as luck would have it, the very day that the news of this sale comes out happens to be the day he's meeting the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Crown Prince Faisal. And Faisal at the time is actually the putative leader of Saudi Arabia. He soon replaces, at the time, King Saud. So here's Rusk. He said this is going to be a terrible precedent, and he says this is going to cause grave damage to our relations with the Arabs. So does Faisal come in and say, that's it? We're done with you? You're dead to me? Look what you did? We can't work with you? Does Faisal do that? It's a rhetorical question. No. What does Faisal do? Faisal doesn't complain about the arms to Israel. What does he complain about? He complains about the coup in Yemen that Nasser is behind. And he says Nasser is doing this to gain a foothold in the Arabian Peninsula to threaten Saudi Arabia. You need to stop this, and you need to provide us assurances on arms. So what was supposed to cause grave damage doesn't even come up. What does come up is his preoccupation with what he sees as a threat to Saudi Arabia. 1 week later, Faisal sees President Kennedy. Has he had time to reconsider and say, gee, I really should have raised the Israeli arms, right? Does he do that? Does he come in and complain about that? Is that what he's focused on? It's a rhetorical question again. No. He comes in and he says, your outreach to Egypt is a threat to the region. Your economic assistance to Egypt is freeing up resources and monies that Egypt is using to threaten all your friends and to change the balance of power in the region against your friends and against America's interest. Does that sound familiar to you? Remember I said there'll be echoes in chapters that reverberate in time, and you hear them over and over again. Does it sound familiar? Yes. If you substitute the word Iran for Egypt, isn't that exactly the same conversation we've been having with Saudi Arabia for the last year? The deal with Iran was going to come at their expense. The deal with Iran was going to relieve sanctions. That was going to provide dramatically more monies to Iran and dramatically increase their troublemaking capabilities in the region. What does this reveal? What do these two examples show you? What they show is that basically what drives the Arabs are their priorities, their concerns. Their most important priority is security and survival. Israel isn't seen as threatening their security or their survival. Their regional competitors are seen as threatening their security and their survival. Their priorities are what shape them. They are not, and they never have, made their relationship with us in any way dependent on what we do with Israel, because that doesn't relate to their security and their survival. This is something that is fundamental. This is something that should be guiding us when we approach the area. Unfortunately, frequently, it has not. All right, one last the one last assumption, then I'm going to wrap up. I said the third assumption was that you can't transform the region or our place in it unless you solve the Palestinian problem. This has also been an enduring assumption. What is different about this assumption is it's shared not only by those who see Israel as a problem, but by at least some who also see Israel as a partner. But if there was ever a time that demonstrated the lack of validity of this assumption, it's today. I mean, think about it. You know, to use the technical term for it, if the Moshiach arrives and you could solve the Israeli-Palestinian issue, would it stop one barrel bomb in Syria? Would it move ISIS back 1 meter in Iraq or Syria? Would it change the existential struggle that you see in Egypt right now between President Sisi and the Muslim Brotherhood and the radical Islamists? Would it end the proxy war in Yemen? Would it prevent Libya from falling apart? These are also rhetorical questions. You know, you're looking at someone who spent the last 30 years of his life trying to make peace between Israelis and Palestinians. I still believe in it. I still will work for it. If you like a one-state outcome, then you like what you're seeing right now, because that's what you're going to have. I believe in it because ultimately it's important for the Israelis, and by the way, it's important for Palestinians too. But I didn't, and I never worked on it because I thought, when we do this, it takes care of the region. It was never going to take care of the region. And if you needed any proof of that, just look at the region today. All right, so the title of the book is called Doomed to Succeed. It's not called Doomed to Succeed ? Even though there has been obviously tension in this administration. And there have been differences. There have been differences over time. The relationship that Obama has with Netanyahu is not unprecedented. The relationship that Reagan had with Begin was bad. The relationship that George H.W. Bush had with Yitzhak Shamir was bad. There was one point where Bill Clinton, who, as I said, believed we shouldn't create a public wedge with Israel. And he never did. But there was one point where he was so mad at Bibi, who was then the prime minister also, that when Bibi came to the country, he didn't see him, he didn't talk to him on the phone, even though their planes were parked next to each other at LAX. So it's not unprecedented, and yet the reason the book is doomed to succeed is because Israel's the only democracy in the Middle East. We share values with Israel, we share interests with Israel, we share threats with Israel. We can have differences with Israel, and that's what you see in different administrations. We can have differences with Israel, but the fundamentals tend to bring us back. And that will be even more true over the next 10 to 20 years for a very simple reason. Look at the region. This is a region that's going to be characterized by the most fundamental conflict, meaning fundamental in the sense it's over identity, and who defines it, and who controls it, and who shapes it. The violence is so terrible because it's on something as fundamental as identity. And when people are defending their identity, nothing is more basic. Now, for the next 10 to 20 years, we're going to see threats to the Arab state system, a struggle to see who's going to determine who defines identity. And Israel will stand in sharp contrast to that, because there is one country in the region that is governed by a rule of law. There is one country in the region where there's a separation of powers. There is one country in the region that has an independent judiciary. There is one country in the region where there are regularly and unregularly scheduled elections, where the loser accepts the outcome, where there's freedom of speech and freedom of assembly, where there is a vibrant civil society, where there is complete artistic freedom, where women's rights are respected, where gay rights are respected. There's no other country but Israel that has those rights. Does Israel have problems? Yes. Does it need to deal with the Palestinians if it wants to retain its Jewish democratic character? Yes. But Israel has institutions, and it will manage its problems. And ultimately, that's the reason the title of the book is called Doomed to Succeed. Thank you. So I will take a few questions. I see you first. I'll repeat the questions.
Is it true that Spain has put an order to detain Netanyahu?
Question was, is it true that Spain has put an order to detain Netanyahu? This goes back to the Mare Mara, which was nine Turkish boats tried to break in 2010, tried to break the Israeli embargo on anything going into Gaza. And the Israelis intercepted one, there was a battle, 9 Turks were killed, and so there were cases brought, and Spain is recognizing that, even though we have been opposed to this. There was nothing that was resolved in the UN over this. So they have put something out. I don't know whether it has any real standing or not. Back there?
Did President Obama personally reject the 3 arguments that you've offered here tonight? And if so, did that play a role in your decision to step down?
I think that. All right. The question was, did President Obama reject these arguments I just made, meaning did he accept the assumptions I was describing, and is that the reason I stepped down? First, I stepped down because I promised my wife I would stay 2 years, and I stayed 3 years, and I've said on a number of occasions, she's permanent and the job was temporary, so I opted to go with her. I didn't leave because of a policy difference. It isn't to say I agreed with everything, but I always felt when I was there I had my day in court. I always felt that I got a complete and fair hearing. In the first term, there was a lot of diversity around President Obama. In the second term, there's much less. So in the first term, there were a lot of debates in front of him. And he's a very good listener. What I was describing about him, and I say this in the Obama chapter, Obama on security issues with Israel was very good. He used to say when I was in the Oval Office, when it comes, whatever our differences are, we wall off security. And we put the differences to the side. And he was true to that. By the same token, he viewed the Palestinians as being weak and the Israelis as being strong. And he put the entire onus on the Israelis and none on the Palestinians. He often treated the Palestinians as if they were too weak to criticize. And I used to say, if they're too weak to criticize, they're too weak to be accountable. If they're too weak to be accountable, they're too weak to have a state. You don't do the Palestinians any favors when you give them a pass. I think what I just described, this dichotomy of seeing Israel strong and therefore the onus is on them, that was something the president very much believed. That is something I think, that's something I didn't accept. But I didn't leave because of policy differences. Yeah.
Iran deal. Good strategic move or bad deal?
Iran deal. Good strategic move or bad deal? Next question. Look, I was very outspoken on this deal, outspoken in the sense that I was undecided. I was undecided not because if the deal is enforced, it doesn't buy you 15 years. It buys you 15 years. There's an irony, by the way, right now. One of the reasons the meeting with Obama and Bibi went well is because Bibi, having opposed the Iran deal, has a huge stake now in ensuring it gets enforced. Because if it is enforced, you buy 15 years. So I wasn't undecided because I thought it didn't buy you 15 years. I thought it bought you 15 years. I wasn't undecided because I thought once the 5+1 had negotiated it, that you could renegotiate it. Because none of the other members of 5+1 were going to come back to the table. And that would have meant if Congress blocked the deal, we would have been blamed, not the Iranians. And then you wouldn't sustain sanctions then. So that wasn't the reason I was undecided. So you might ask, so how come you were undecided? The reason I was undecided was because after 15 years, Iran gets treated as if they're Japan or the Netherlands. They can build as large a nuclear program, quantity and quality, as they want. And they're not Japan or the Netherlands. And I felt that the administration they didn't need to renegotiate the deal, but they needed to take a series of steps to bolster our deterrent. If after 15 years, the gap between nuclear threshold status and weapon status is going to be very small, the Iranians need to know now, not in year 15. They need to know now. They need to get used to the idea now that there'll be a firewall there. If they move towards a weapon at that point, it means force, not sanctions. They lose their whole nuclear infrastructure. They need to know that now. We need to be blunt about that now. We need to reinforce that now. They need to know as well, if they cheat along the margins of the deal, there'll be a penalty, even for small violations, so that we create a pattern of behavior that shows when you transgress, you pay a price. Whatever it is, low to high. You're more credible on the high end if you're insistent on imposing a price for everything. And that was something else I wanted done. I wanted us to reinforce our words of creating a firewall by punctuating it with an action. And I wanted us to provide the Israelis something called a massive ordnance penetrator, which is a 30,000-pound bomb. And the Israelis don't have a plane that could carry it. This is a mountain buster, not a bunker buster. I wanted to do that because the message it would send is that maybe you question whether we'll act, even if we have tough words, but if you dash towards a weapon, nobody questions whether the Israelis will act. And with the mop, the Israelis are able to hit every target in Iran. So I wanted us to target sanctions on destabilizing behavior in the region if, after the Iranians get sanctions relief, they provide a whole lot more money to Hezbollah, which I believe they will do. We're already seeing them become more aggressive in the region for a very simple reason. The supreme leader did this deal to get sanctions relief, not to change his ideology. And to prove that his ideology isn't any different, they become more aggressive. You see what's happening in Iran. They're arresting journalists. They're arresting poets. You know, there's a real struggle going on right now. Rouhani is being criticized as well. And the supreme leader, if you look at what's called his endorsement of the deal, look at what he says. Almost everything in it looks like he's walking away. So they will carry out, for the first 6 months, what they have to do. You know, they will reduce the stockpile of their low-enriched uranium from 12,000 kilograms to 300. That's a significant thing, because it means they go from 10 bombs worth of material to less than 1, and they're kept there for 15 years. They'll do that. They will they will store 13,500 centrifuges, which they have to do. They will take the core of their heavy water reactor out and fill it with cement, which they have to do. And they will create a verification system to monitor the whole supply chain of where you mine uranium, where you mill it and turn it into yellow cake, where you take that yellow cake and convert it into UF6 hexafluoride, which is a gas, and where you take that gas and you feed it into a centrifuge to enrich. They will do those things. It'll take them 6 months. But I worry that after 6 months, then they'll start to cheat along the margins. And they'll do it to test how good the verification system is. And we have to not just be vigilant, we have to be prepared to impose penalties when they do that. So I wanted us to spell out the things I just said. And had we done that, my position would have been different. Because we didn't do it, I remain undecided about the deal, and I have unease about it. Yes?
What do you think will happen with Kurds? Are they going to be a force to be reckoned with, or are they just disposable in the great scheme of things?
What do I think will happen to the Kurds? Are they a force to be reckoned with, or are they dispensable? Well, right now, they're the one force that actually fights ISIS. But understand, they fight it in their area. They don't go outside their area. Just like the Shia, the Shia militias, we're not seeing them liberate Ramadi, because Ramadi is Sunni. In Iraq, what we're seeing, you fight in your area. If we're going to change things in Iraq, we probably should be providing more to the Kurds, and we probably should be providing arms directly to the Sunnis and not through the government. Now, I would have done it, I would use the government's desire for us to do everything through them as a lever to say, look, we will do it through you if you actually provide the arms to the Sunnis, but they're not. So if you want to recover the areas in Iraq that ISIS now controls, you're going to need Sunnis to be able to do it. And it's very difficult to do that right now without that. Now, as for the Kurds, the Kurds are, they're expanding their hold in areas that they have considered not just theirs, but what they've always considered theirs. A place like Kirkuk, which was a source of real it was a source of real difference between the central government and the Kurds. Today the Kurds control Kirkuk and the oil fields there. Good luck getting them to give that up. This is something that they're pretty determined to hold on to. So I think we should be supportive of the Kurds, particularly now when if we ever had a need to roll back ISIS, it's now. By the way, one of the reasons ISIS tries to present itself as an invincible movement. The caliphate is supposed to be something that reflects their purity. So if they start to lose, that's one of the reasons I think they're carrying out these things, these plans of attacks in Europe as a way of diverting attention, as I said earlier. But if they start to lose, it begins to undercut their appeal. I mean, one of the things I've argued for, and it's one of these things where my recommendations have been greeted with restrained enthusiasm. If you really want to discredit ISIS, one of the things you have to do is when the Kurds, for example, capture ISIS prisoners, take pictures and put it in social media. I mean, the ISIS is expert at using social media. Put on social media the ISIS fighters who are surrendering with their hands up. How can you be a divine messenger and you're surrendering? I mean, again, if you want to undercut their ideology and their appeal, you have to show there is no purity there. You have to show there is no invincibility there. They're trying to create that impression. We should be doing everything we can, not just to inflict setbacks, but to reveal them for what they are. Yeah.
I don't know if you touched on this earlier, but when you talk about this constituency that it's anti-Israel, I mean, there's obviously this issue of economics about the Arabs and the oil, and there's issues of politics and so on. But in particular, because we're talking about Israel, there's also an issue about Jews.
Yeah.
Do you sense that this, I mean, I think that there was for a very long time in this country, for sure, an anti-Semitic trend, especially with people in power. Do you think that's changed over time, or is that still an issue?
The question was a lot of it, with the constituency that saw Israel through the lens of being a real problem, there was obviously oil interests and the like. Was there also an anti-Semitic undertone there? I would say if you go back through Nixon, the answer is yes, there was. Since that time, no. It's not, you really don't see that. A real turning point actually is Reagan again, because George Shultz makes a decision that anybody who serves in the Near East Affairs Bureau, who is going to rise in the Near East Affairs Bureau, they have to serve on the Israeli desk and in Israel as well as in Arab countries. I mean, prior to that time, believe it or not, anybody who worked on the Israeli desk, they also worked on the South Africa desk, they worked on the Taiwan desk. Israel was truly treated up until that time as being a pariah. That's the way it was treated. From Schultz's time on, that gets transformed. So you really see a change in the character. Earlier, you also, there's this one I have it as a footnote. There was a CIA assessment in the Kennedy administration describing Jewish scientists helping the Israelis to produce a nuclear capability, and the language that I quoted in a footnote, the language in it is stunning. I mean, well, these are Jewish scientists. What would you expect? Literally, that's the language. And what makes it so clear, this is when you still see the anti-Semitism, that these guys thought it was okay to write that. It didn't set off an alarm bell. How might this be read? No, this is the way people thought. So I would say up till Nixon. Back there?
Given that the Palestinians consider it 2 weeks to negotiate with, why isn't Israel negotiating with Jordan and Egypt to take over those areas?
Yeah, and the question is, so shouldn't Israel be negotiating with Egypt and Jordan because the Palestinians are really sort of too weak as negotiators now? It is true that I do think we're going to have a new paradigm for approaching this issue. I don't think that a strictly bilateral negotiation between Israelis and Palestinians can work now, because the Palestinians, I see no circumstance under which they would be prepared to negotiate anytime soon. I see no circumstance in which they could make any concessions. If they're going to be if you're going to have a peace deal, they have to make concessions, but they can't make them. So someone else needs to assume the responsibility for those concessions, and that probably has to be not just Egypt and Jordan, but some collection of Arab states. The question is whether the Arab states right now have enough bandwidth and enough interest to be prepared to do this, given everything else that they're consumed with. And do they have enough confidence in us? Because if they're going to expose themselves on this issue, they're going to have to feel they can count on us. And I think right now that's more problematic than it's been. But it's also not such a simple thing for Arabs to say, we're going to assume responsibility for Palestinians. Palestinians somehow have to be prepared to say, we're prepared to do this with our Arab brothers. They won't do it in place of the Palestinians, but they could do it in league with the Palestinians. And my sense is at some point, you're going to have a number of Arab leaders play a different kind of role than they have if you're going to be able to produce peace. The alternative is likely to be, to do in a sense what Rabin told me in 1994, that he knew to ensure that Israel wouldn't become a binational state, he knew there was going to have to be partition. He wanted to negotiate the partition, as he put it, with the Palestinians, but if that wasn't going to be possible, then he was going to build a separation barrier. He is the father of the separation barrier. Back there.
Could you comment on the Russian entry into Syria, please?
Yes. Look, I think to understand the Russian entry into Syria, to understand Putin's entry, you have to understand the following. Putin sensed there was a vacuum and he could fill it. He's pretty good at doing things like that. He had, I think, multiple objectives. The first objective was to sustain the Russian presence in Syria, meaning the military presence. They've had a kind of port of call and a kind of a not really a base, but it's been where their Navy basically would restock and would refuel and would basically come to port at Tartus. He was going to sustain a Russian military presence in Syria, number one. Number two, he was going to make it clear that there could be no outcome in Syria where the Russians weren't an arbiter of that outcome. Number three, he was going to send a message that basically, in the issues that are unfolding in the Middle East now, if you want to deal with them, you need to deal with Russia. And at a time when we were trying to say Russia's been isolated because of Ukraine, he was going to demonstrate quite the contrary, that they're a central player. To understand Putin is to understand that he said that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the worst geopolitical tragedy of the 20th century. I mean, I like to say it wasn't even the worst geopolitical tragedy for the Russians. But that's the way he sees it. And by the way, he plays on that xenophobic sense of loss of stature, loss of status, exploitation, efforts to keep Russia weak. Look, he has, at a time when Russia's economy is in a deep recession because of very low oil prices and because of sanctions, he's got close to an 80% approval rating. And it's because he plays upon this sense that he is putting Russia on the world stage. And that matters a lot, psychologically. So Syria is part and parcel of doing that. And he had the opportunity to do it. And he's not acting as if he has an enormous amount of respect for us right now. All the way in the back.
Do you think the IAEA inspection system, as well as Western nations' intelligence systems, can catch the Iranians cheating on the agreement?
Yeah, I actually do. I mean, do I think they can catch? Do I think they can catch all the cheating? Look, it may not be possible to catch everything. What a lot of people focused on in this deal was the fact that for undeclared sites, that the Iranians have a 24-day period before they would be forced to allow access. Now, the truth is, for undeclared sites, this is undeclared sites, a suspect site. Anything that's declared, we have 24/7 coverage of. which is why it makes it very difficult to have a covert program, because we have coverage of their whole supply chain. If you're going to have a covert enrichment program, you have to have secret means, you have to have secret uranium stashed, you have to have yellow cake that you've stashed, you have to have UF6 that you've stashed, you have to be able to have a secret area where you can keep, in a sense, you could have secret enrichment going on. But we have 24/7 of all that. That falls under the category of declared. The undeclared is where the 24 days comes in, and 24 days is not enough if you were doing something that had fissile material. If you're doing experiments with fissile material, that would remain in the atmosphere. It takes years for that to go away. The problem would be if they're running computer simulations where they are running simulations to figure out how you weaponize. You know, there, if you can't go in and surprise them, you're not going to catch them. So those are the kind of things that they could be cheating on. But the big things that would be the most concerning, it'll be very difficult for them to cheat on. You know, unless we allow them to cheat and get away with it. But see, when the president said the agreement was based on verification, not trust, I said, no, the agreement is based on deterrence. The agreement, if we catch them, that's not going to stop them from cheating if they think we can catch them. What's going to stop them from cheating is if they know we're going to catch them and then they're going to pay a price for having done it. So that's why I say we need to enforce this in a way where they know they pay a price if they cheat, even if they cheat in a small way. And we'll see. My guess is, the president has a pretty strong incentive in having made promises about how vigilant we're going to be. I think he has a pretty strong incentive to live up to what he said. Yeah. Oh, I have to turn right. You got to tell me. This is like a political statement. Yeah.
What concerns me is that Reagan called us a Christian nation, and when I take a look at the Middle East, 20% of Palestinians are Christian. The Syrian Orthodox Church, the oldest Catholic church in the world, there's a purging of the Christian world out of the Middle East.
Yeah.
And the American people are just, we got oil, maybe it's not a Jewish thing, is what I'm saying. I mean, is there a greater political tide here that we're swinging against?
I think the question was, the question was, the Christians in the Middle East are under siege and in a sense are declining. And are we swimming? The question was, are we swimming against some kind of larger tide here? And I would say, I wouldn't. The real issue happens to be minorities in the Middle East, not just Christian. Minorities in the Middle East. One of the things that has to change is an acceptance that majorities in the Middle East have to be prepared to accept minorities. That has never been the case. If you really want to see a transformation in the Middle East, that's what you need to see. Now, we're not seeing it. On the contrary, what we're seeing is a kind of battle over identities. And I said, this is what I said before, this is going on for the next 10 to 20 years. It's not going away anytime soon. So I wouldn't focus on the Christians per se. I would focus on the issue of how are minorities treated everywhere. And you find not very well. I will say this. There is one place, Egypt, with all the difficulties of Egypt right now, the Coptic Christians, after Sisi came in, they were leaving in droves under the Muslim Brotherhood. They have come back. He went and he's appeared with the leader of the Coptic Church. He's sent a message in that regard. There may be other things he's doing in terms of imprisoning non-Islamists, which I think is a mistake, but I think the one thing he's made an effort to do is to recognize they have a 10% Christian minority in Egypt. And this is one place where you see an effort being made. He's also making an effort to see the textbooks changed as well. So, I mean, there are signs, at least in Sisi's Egypt, that someone is trying to do something different when it comes to minorities.
Last question, please.
All right. This is the last question, so there's no pressure. All right, so the person who is... I mean, you really want to ask that question, I can tell. Yeah, you. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, actually, it's a three-part.
One part.
Okay, it's been said that the strategy behind what ISIS is doing is trying to turn the people in the U.S. and in Europe to turn us against the Muslims that live amongst us.
Right.
And in so doing, having the younger Muslims feel very oppressed, and then the ISIS being able to go and pull them in.
Right.
So I wanted you to comment on that, and then if you would, about into the state of the CIA today.
Okay. Well, I understood the first question. The second question I'm less clear on. But, all right, so the question was, ISIS does refer to this gray zone. And they do seem to want to provoke what I call polarization. They do seem to want to provoke a kind of backlash against Muslims with the expectation that will then produce many more recruits for them. And I don't think we should, I mean, I think we need to be very mindful. The United States and Europe, we need to be, we have been countries ruled by law. And we should continue to be countries ruled by law. We need to somehow find a way to deal with the security challenges, the security threats, in a way that doesn't somehow produce the backlash that maybe they want to trigger. Because it then becomes self-defeating for us. So somehow, some way, we have to find, and it's not, by the way, it's not a simple thing to balance. Because, you inevitably you get this tension between civil liberties and security. And when the balance shifts towards a preoccupation with security, you tend to say, well, civil liberties become less important. This goes beyond the question you're asking, but I think it's part and parcel of what you're asking. So we have to do everything we can to try to retain a healthy respect for law and a balance, so that in the end we don't play into the hands, we don't lose who we are, we don't change who we are. They also want to change who we are, right? I mean, in the end, for all their hatred of democracy and our values, it's clear they fear our values, because they'd like to force us to forsake our values. And ultimately, our great strength is our values, and we should ultimately live by them. Thank you very much.
Thank you again to Ambassador Dennis Ross for an inspiring and thought-provoking and wonderful presentation. Thanks to all of you for being here. I want to encourage you to take a few moments to purchase the book, which is outside of the book-sale table. And then you can line up to have the book signed if you would like to have that done. I imagine you would like that very much. And if you're on your way home right away, drive safely. Thank you all for being here.